"Get her out of here. She has no right to be in this house." Valerie's voice cut through the tense air like a whip. Hands grabbed at Mora's arms, pushing, shoving, desperate to expel the quiet woman they refused to see as an heir. But before they could force her out, a sharp voice rang through the room. "You're welcome to try," Mr. Calder said, stepping forward. "But this house belongs to her. You have to leave." Rain gnawed at the windows of Lancaster and Ridgewell, each drop a quiet tapping reminder of the sorrow that had settled over the city since Edward Holden's death. A titan in the world of technology, Edward had been as mysterious as he was brilliant. The newspapers still ran stories about the silent billionaire, who changed energy infrastructure and vanished from public life in the last 5 years. But today, the veil was being pulled back, at least a little. The law firm's conference room buzzed with murmurs and perfumed tension. Leather chairs groaned under designer coats and jewel-toned dresses. Gold watches glinted. Makeup was perfect. The grief, not so much. "Well, this should be interesting," muttered Calvin Holden, Edward's nephew, leaning back with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I bet he left half of it to his pet conservation project and the other half to his offshore trust." "He better not have," snapped Valerie Holden, Edward's younger sister, wrapped in a thick fur coat despite the firm's generous heating. "I practically raised him after Mother died. This company wouldn't exist if I hadn't kept the family together." Their mother's pearls glistened around her throat, an heirloom she had taken before probate could stop her. Edward's father, John Holden, sat stone-faced, eyes narrowed. Though he hadn't spoken to Edward in years, today he wore a mourning pin and the same tailored suit he'd worn to business summits decades ago. Pride and bitterness dressed the same. "He should have let us manage the will," muttered John to no one in particular. "He always liked his secrets more than his family." "Secrets don't pay estate taxes," Calvin said, half laughing. A few others chuckled, a gallery of cousins, executives, old friends turned board members. Each bore the quiet greed of expectation. They whispered in low tones, speculating about the billions tied to Holden Industries, the ecotech patents, the mysterious Redwood Island property. But no one noticed the woman standing by the coat rack. She was quiet, unremarkable in appearance. A simple dress, hair pinned back with care but not vanity. Her eyes drifted gently over the room, observing without imposing. Her hands stayed folded before her. She took up no more space than necessary, a presence so gentle it was almost mistaken for absence. She did not correct them. A clerk offered her a bottle of water. She declined with a soft smile. She watched as they argued about who was closest to Edward, who had sacrificed what, who deserved which piece of the empire. Each claim louder than the last. She listened but said nothing. The clock ticked toward noon. Mr. Calder, Edward's long-time lawyer, finally entered. His presence hushed the room. Grey-haired, dignified, and deliberate, he looked over the gathering like a man surveying a chessboard about to reset. "Thank you all for coming," he said, voice rich and composed. "Mr. Holden left very specific instructions. The reading of the will take place in its entirety. No interruptions." He gave a sharp glance that sliced through Calvin's open mouth. "Some of you may be surprised," he continued, placing a thick blue-bound envelope on the polished oak table. "Others, perhaps, disappointed. But Mr. Holden's wishes are final, and I have been entrusted to deliver them without amendment." "Let's get on with it," John Holden growled. "He's dead. The living have things to do." The lawyer's eyes flicked toward the quiet woman by the wall. She nodded once, barely perceptibly. He took a breath, then broke the seal. Outside, the rain fell harder. The city blurred beyond the windows. But inside, Every breath was held. And in the back corner, the simple woman stood like a shadow of the past no one remembered, waiting for the storm that was about to come. The room had fallen into a brittle silence as Mr. Calder cleared his throat and began to read. Every eye was fixed on him, every breath held tight. "To my father, John Holden," he started, his voice steady, "I leave the painting of St. Andrew that hangs in the western corridor of the Redwood estate. It was the only thing my father ever said I chose with taste." John Holden's lips pressed into a thin line. He shifted uneasily in his chair, but said nothing. Calvin's fingers drummed impatiently against the mahogany table. "That's it. A painting," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for a few nearby to hear. "Valerie," Mr. Calder continued, "I bequeath the Montrose vineyards in Sonoma. You are to maintain them as I envisioned. No developers, no commercial exploitation. The Holden Foundation will fund their upkeep indefinitely." Valerie's expression tightened. She opened her mouth to protest, but closed it again, her pride holding her tongue. "To Calvin, my nephew," Calder read on, "I leave the Lakehurst cabin and the manuscript of my unpublished memoirs. He must read them entirely before any consideration of sale or transfer." Calvin's face twisted into a sneer. "What about the shares? The company stock?" Mr. Calder gave no sign he heard. "To the loyal members of the board," he said, "I leave my thanks and a share of the research grants from the Holden Foundation." Some nodded politely, others exchanged wary glances. The mood was tense, but still expectant. The family seemed ready for the big reveal, the big money, the ultimate prize. Then Mr. Calder paused. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes sweeping the room, landing briefly on the quiet woman standing near the coat-rack, the one no one had really noticed. His voice softened, lowered in a way that made every head snap toward him. "And now," he said, "to the woman who taught me how to breathe again, who never needed diamonds to shine, nor public acclaim to matter." A charged silence stretched taut, hanging heavy in the air. "I leave the controlling shares of Holden Industries, Redwood Island, and all my personal correspondence, letters I wrote but never sent." A gasp burst from the crowd. "Who is she?" Valerie demanded, standing abruptly, her voice sharp, incredulous. John's hand slammed the table. "I don't know any woman worthy of this." Calvin's jaw dropped. "This has to be a mistake." Mr. Calder's voice rang clear. "Her name is Mara." The room froze. All eyes swung to the quiet woman. She stood still, calm as a lake at dawn, unmoved by the shock waves crashing around her. Valerie stared, her face draining of color. You're the woman from those letters?" Her voice shook with disbelief and rage. Calvin sneered. "An assistant, a nobody." "She was the love of Edward Holden's life," Mr. Calder said sharply, silencing the room. Mara did not speak. Her eyes held a gentle strength. Calder pressed on. Edward wished her to be here today. It was his last directive that she inherit the legacy he could never share in life. A heavy silence settled, thick and suffocating. Then, as if breaking through the fragile calm, Valerie stepped forward, her voice a venomous hiss. "This house, this family, it doesn't belong to you," she spat, gesturing wildly. "You're a stranger. You have no right here." Calvin joined in, stepping up beside her. "Get out. Now. Before we call security." Mora's composure wavered for only a moment before she straightened. "You can try," she said quietly. But before she could take a step forward, John Holden grabbed her arm roughly and pushed her toward the heavy oak door. "Get out," he barked, his voice shaking with rage. "You don't belong here." Mora stumbled but held her ground, looking each of them in the eye. Suddenly, A sharp voice cut through the chaos. "You're welcome to try," came the calm, commanding tone of the family lawyer, Mr. Calder. "But you'll find the will is ironclad." The room fell into stunned silence. The lawyer stepped forward, blocking the door. "This house, the shares, everything named in that will, they belong to Mora. You have no legal right to push her out." Valerie's face twisted in fury. "This isn't over," she hissed, backing away. Calvin scowled, but he said nothing. Mora looked around the room once more. She took a deep breath. "This house," she said quietly but firmly, "is mine, and I'm not leaving." The storm outside had quieted, but the storm inside the room was just beginning. Mora stood before the table, before the generations of power, pride, and poisoned ambition, calm and unshaken. Mr. Calder had just uttered the final, irrevocable words that shattered the illusion everyone in that room had clung to, that Edward Halden's fortune would stay in the family. But it hadn't. It was hers. The silence now wasn't the stunned kind. It was charged, bitter, suspicious, and crackling with disbelief. Valerie said, "This is absurd," she hissed. "That woman, Mora, what does she even know about running a company? About legacy?" Edward was a genius, but he was also sick toward the end. Who knows what she convinced him of? "She didn't convince him of anything," Calder replied coolly. "Edward was of sound mind when he signed his final testament. I oversaw it personally. In fact, he wrote this will twice, once a year ago, and once more just 3 weeks before his death. The contents were identical." John's voice followed, like gravel being ground beneath a wheel. "This is an embarrassment. To give our name, our empire, to a stranger. No, I will contest this." "You're welcome to try," Calder said, "but you'll find it ironclad." Mora finally spoke. "I didn't come here for anyone's empire," she said quietly. Her voice was calm but steady, resonant in its sincerity. "I came because Edward asked me to, in a letter I received after his death." Calvin scoffed. "Letters? How convenient." She turned to him. "Not that I owe you an explanation, but I knew Edward before any of you did. Before the money. Before the titles. When he was just a young man chasing light and ideas, and not yet haunted by the weight of carrying a legacy." Valerie snorted. "So what were you? His therapist? His charity case?" "No," Mora said, her eyes meeting hers unflinchingly. "I was his lighthouse." The words echoed strangely in the room, brushing the edges of something deeper, something none of them understood. Calder cleared his throat. "Edward instructed me to deliver this to Mora personally." He pulled a second envelope from his leather folder and held it out to her. Mora took it with a bow of her head. The envelope was cream, thick, and embossed only with her name, Mora Elise Wren. She ran her fingers over the familiar handwriting, heart thrumming. It felt like he was still here, in this room where she had never truly belonged, and yet now stood at the very center. "I'd like to read it," she said softly. "Not for any of you, but for him." Mora opened the envelope and pulled out the single folded sheet. Her hands were steady. "Mora, if you're hearing this, it means I've finally stopped running from my ghosts. I never had the courage to bring you into this world of mine, not because you weren't worthy, but because I feared it would destroy the gentleness I loved in you. You were always light in a room full of shadows. I was afraid I'd turn you into one of us. But I've come to understand something you tried to teach me when I was too proud to listen. Light doesn't dim in darkness. It shines brighter. Everything I built from ambition. But the only thing I ever truly made with love was the life I imagined with you. Take Redwood Island. It's where I finally learned to breathe. Take the company, if you choose to. Or don't. I trust you to do what's right. Not for the board, not for the shareholders, but for the world. You always believed we could build something kinder. Now you have the power to try. I love you, always. Edward. When she finished reading, the room was silent again, but not in resistance this time. Something had shifted. Even the most hardened faces were softened by the weight of Edward's words. Valerie sat back, dazed. Calvin looked away, and John Holden, the stone-faced patriarch, lowered his gaze. He didn't speak again. Mara folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope like something sacred. "I won't be CEO," she said. "I don't want power for the sake of power. But I will decide what happens next. Holden Industries won't be run by greed anymore. If I have anything to do with it, it'll be run by purpose." She looked at Mr. Calder. "I want the Holden Foundation to expand. Education, clean energy, mental health resources, and I want to start with a grant program for underprivileged students in cities Edward once ignored." Calder nodded, a flicker of admiration in his otherwise stoic face. "And Redwood Island?" he asked. Mara smiled faintly. "I think I'll go there for a while. I owe him that much. And myself." She turned and began to walk out of the room, past the leather chairs and silk scarves and open mouths. No one stopped her. At the door she paused. Her voice floated back like a final ribbon in the air. "Edward once told me the most dangerous lie people tell themselves is that kindness is weakness. He believed that once. I didn't. And I never will." And with that, she left. Outside, the rain had cleared. The city breathed again. The skies opened just enough to let the sun peek through. Mara stepped into the light. She had come as a shadow. Now she walked away carrying the legacy of a man who had finally remembered what it meant to love, openly, fiercely, and without fear. And she would carry that legacy not in boardrooms or stock markets, but in the way she turned his empire into a lighthouse, one that would never go dark again.